national economy, we also had a national framework to regulate that national economy. So we passed in 1863, in the middle of the Civil War, we passed the first banking regulation. Why did we do it in the middle of the Civil War? Well, the point was that there was a belief that after the Civil War we would have a national economy, and that with a national economy you needed a national banking regulatory system. Well, we don't have the frameworks within which to make those decisions today. So let me just conclude. The silver lining on the global crisis is that it has brought home the need for global cooperation, and it's also brought home the risks of a failure. In the aftermath of the Great Depression and World War II, we realized the problems, the risk of not having global cooperation, and we created the current international institutions. But that's more than 60 years ago. And those institutions are really not up to the task of the current global economy. So the hope is, the silver lining on this crisis is that we will now recognize this problem, that we'll seize this opportunity to try to create more effective global institutions to address the problem of global financial stability. Thank you.
And thank you for an excellent lecture, both in terms of your analysis of our GFC, we thought that term was used everywhere, but also some ideas for cooperation and where we should go in the future. Okay, we have about 10 minutes. I know that there are some people that have to leave. We've got some questions here. I think there's a roving mic down here at the front. Yeah.
Good evening, Professor Stiglitz. It's a great honor for me to ask a question of a man like you, especially as I handed up today what I hope will be the last iteration of my PhD, which is on financial regulation. And I've read with great interest what you've said about a need for a global college of supervisors, etc. And because I have great respect for you and for your work, I hope you will understand that if my question is somewhat tongue-in-cheek, it's not out of disrespect. Sir, I come to this question not from the perspective of an economist, but from the perspective of a lawyer. And I look at this problem, and my thesis in particular dealt with the collapse of the Indonesian banking sector. And after the collapse of the Indonesian banking sector, organizations like the IMF were adamant that Indonesia needed more financial regulation. And I looked at this and I thought this was interesting because, you know, it wasn't that Indonesia lacked financial regulation. It's that they lacked the enforcement of that financial regulation. And when I look at the concept of government regulators enforcing regulation, I see a group of people who are simply not up to the task. They work 9 to 5. They don't understand many of the products that they're supposed to regulate. They lack the ambition and the drive to do it with gusto. And they're open to a great deal of political interference. You know, for example, Gordon Brown, the previous British Prime Minister, said that they had taken a softly approach to Northern Rock. And there are so many other examples. You cited just one in the last 5 minutes. The Automobile Association, the automobile industry in the United States, working in a political environment that has a very highly developed lobbying system. And that highly developed lobbying system is always going to make the regulator susceptible to political pressure. So the first suggestion I want to make to you is this. Isn't it time... Here's where it's tongue-in-cheek.
Short question now.
Isn't it time to acknowledge that we have a problem? The paradigm of state-based regulation is an habitual and chronic failure.
Yeah. Okay.
Let Professor Stiglitz.
Let me. I mean, obviously, the regulators failed, and there is always going to be a risk that you appoint regulators who don't believe in regulation, and then regulatory systems won't fail. So that's why I think that one of the arcs of the designing regulation is to do it in ways that give less scope for regulatory discretion. So, as an example, one of the benefits of the Glass-Steagall Act is it's a structural rule. You don't allow investment banks and commercial banks to be joined. So that means very simple. It's not very. It doesn't take a high IQ to separate those two and to distinguish what are the activities. But there's a second point I want to raise more generally, that people often say, well, you know, how can a regulator pay so little compete with, you know, regulate high-priced those in the financial sector? And an analogy may be useful, and that is when we're talking about drug regulation, everybody agrees that we ought to have drug regulation. I don't think, or at least not everybody, but most people feel more comfortable knowing that when they take drugs, that they've been tested to see that they're safe and effective. Drug regulation is not perfect. There's a lot of influence to the pharmaceutical industry. You would like it to be weaker, but still, with all those imperfections, we feel a little bit of comfort knowing most of the time that the drugs that we're taking are effective and relatively safe. Now, the people doing the testing don't have to have the same insight into what causes a disease as the people creating the drugs. Testing effectiveness and safety is not as complex in many ways as creating these new products. So there are differences on what are the skills that are required. So in my mind, the parts of the arcs of regulatory design is to try to think of a system that is going to work with people who have are not going to be paid necessarily as well. Now, there are other ways of going about it. In Poland, they have linked the salary of the regulators to those in the financial sector, so that they have tried to even the level playing field. That's going to be creating some interesting dynamics.
We have a question over here.
Hello, thank you, Professor Stiglitz, for giving me this opportunity to ask a question. My name is Stephanie Schur, I'm from the Melbourne Institute, and my question is about the invisible hand of the market, which doesn't exist. I'm quite surprised you haven't mentioned, closer, like that? Okay. Yeah. I'm quite surprised you haven't mentioned Adam Smith's other work on the moral foundations, which he wrote complementary to his book on the wealth of nations. So, the ethics involved, which entrepreneurs must have to make the invisible hand work. And so I want to ask you, incentive structures are not exogenous. You talked tonight as if these incentive structures in the system, they were just put in place like helicopter institution, they're just thrown over individuals. No, they are the product of a long process, and they're the product of the participants in the market. And so you have to ask yourself, who is self-selecting into the financial markets? It's economists who want to make money, or corporate lawyers who want to make money, and then you have to ask, so what type of individuals self-select in there? And who's teaching them? So I'm an economist myself, and I went through my whole career through learning about indicators of success like growth and growth of shareholder value. So we introduced these systems to make money. So people really want to make money who work in the finance sector. So I didn't come across in my whole education any course on ethics. No one made us read the moral foundations of Adam Smith. So I just wanted to know from your perspective what you think about what the economics